Your audience will generally want to be able to decide quickly whether your report contains information that they need to know. The title and the abstract give them this information. The title helps people decide whether the information in your report is useful to them, and the abstract provides a synopsis of your report. The title and abstract are the only part of a report that most people will read. This is especially true in industry. Most managers, project engineers, and executives have, at most, about 10 minutes to devote to any particular report that they receive. So they rely on the abstract to give them all the information they need to make an intelligent decision. You need to make sure that you briefly and completely summarize your results and conclusions in a small space of under a couple of hundred words. If you make it longer than that, it's likely that it will not get read. You especially need to make it clear to your boss whether there are any significant existing problems, any anticipated problems, or conversely, if there are no problems at all. One thing that I need to make very clear before I continue is that all of the guidelines I give you in this video are flexible. Feel free to tailor your abstract to the needs of the information you're transmitting. Especially keep in mind your audience, since the abstract of a report documenting a new test procedure for your peers will contain very different information than a summary of the status of a project for a group of executives who may have very little technical background. These people will be looking for different types of information and will need things explained differently. Right, Bonnie? First, I'll briefly talk about titles. Titles are an extremely short description of the topic of your report for a well-informed audience. There's a great deal of difference between writing a title for graded schoolwork and writing a title for publication in any form, either internal or external, as a professional engineer. Professional documents require a much greater degree of detail in the discrete sections of the report than school projects do. In school, you're told that titles must be short and descriptive. On the other hand, more is better can be true for the title of a professional document, within reason. A good rule of thumb is that a title should be at most 14 to 15 words, or about 2 lines of text. Don't sacrifice including vital information simply for the sake of brevity. The title must contain enough information to ensure that your anticipated audience will understand what material will be presented in your report and whether it's worthwhile to read your abstract. Therefore, a good title can be an entire sentence or a summarizing statement, perhaps with a subtitle that narrows the scope and purpose of the document, or outlines the work that's being reported. If you can fit in any information relative to the results and conclusions that you draw, that's helpful, but not really necessary. Be aware that the title doesn't need to be as complete as the abstract, but it should contain enough information to make it a useful filter for anyone searching for information on your topic. The title shouldn't be too long. Try to keep your titles from being too general. Non-technical publications can get away with general titles, but reports generally can't. Be specific. Now let's take a look at some examples of good and not so good titles. Let's start out with a couple of example titles that I would consider to be good. The first one, Writing Informative Titles for Technical Literature, an aid to efficient information retrieval, talks about wording your title to maximize the chances of people finding your paper when searching for information. The title pretty much says it all. It's clear, simple, and it's not overly wordy. The next example, A Guide to Correct Barking Abroad, a review, is a pastiche article from the Journal of Irreproducible Results. As the name implies, the article is a review of a fictitious longer work which comments on the fact that different cultures phonetically represent dogs barking differently. The supposition is that dogs traveling to foreign countries will need a guide to barking in a foreign language. This title also illustrates another common technique. Colons are used to categorize your document. Now let's look at a couple of not so good titles. This title, Writing Can Still Be the Better Way, doesn't tell a whole heck of a lot about what to expect in the article. The better way to do what? Better compared to what alternate approach? What kind of writing? This one needs a little more context. Finally, here's another not so good example. This one's just too long. It also uses too many specialized terms. The abstract is a short but comprehensive overview of the work you're documenting, your results and conclusions. This is the second pass for your intended audience. If they've decided to continue reading your document based on the title, they'll be searching for specific details to help them decide to read the rest of the document. These details are hinted at in the abstract. Please keep in mind that you're not summarizing the report itself. It's best to refrain from sentences that start out, "This report describes," or "the first item presented in this report is." Items that are commonly included in abstracts are a description of what was done and why it was done. This, like all components of any report, depends on your audience. If you're writing a report to a project engineer who has requested that you perform a specific analysis, a description of something she already knows is probably just irritating. Also, if relevant, you may want to tell a little bit about how the work was done, if you can keep the description of the methodology to a sentence or two. Keep in mind that minute details of your analysis approach or the model number of the sensor you used to measure pressure probably won't be of interest here. You'll definitely want to provide your main results and your conclusions or recommendations. Be sure you highlight any problems you foresee as a result of your work or the lack thereof. You definitely do not want to be responsible for a problem not being fixed because you buried it somewhere in a report where no one noticed it. Or worse yet, you didn't mention it at all. Likewise, you don't want to make someone read a lengthy report just to find out that there's nothing they need to worry about. Be concise. If you don't waste people's time, they'll probably remember you fondly when it comes time to give raises. I want to devote a little time to talking about how long an abstract should be, but the abstract length isn't usually as important as most people think it is. For example, when I was an undergraduate, the advice I mostly received about abstracts was along the lines of, make it as short as you can and then cut it in half. Apart from the logical problems associated with this, it made me feel like the length of the abstract was more important than the content. My advice is that you should make your abstract as long as it needs to be to get the necessary information across, and no longer. A maximum abstract length is probably about 200 or 300 words. This will take people about 10 or 15 minutes to read it, which is about as much time as most management will allocate to review a report. If it's any longer than this, it's likely it'll be tossed aside and not read at all. A conclusion or recommendation that doesn't get read may as well never have been written. So keep your abstract terse and to the point without sacrificing vital content. As I said, I typically shoot for less than 200 or 300 words, about the length of a typical paragraph. I readily admit that none of these bullet points are terribly informative on their own. So next, I want to present a few examples of abstracts and see how they address these points. My first example is an article by John Doyle called Guaranteed Margins for LQG Regulators. This has probably my all-time favorite abstract title combination, if the term favorite can really be used in the context of a technical report. The context of this article is that when designing a control system, it's desirable to have a certain amount of margin in your controller. It's more or less a safety margin kind of thing. Anyway, there are a category of controllers called linear quadratic Gaussian regulators. These are, in some sense, optimal, which means they do the best possible job of any regulator. However, people at this time were having trouble determining whether there was any guarantee about what kind of margins these controllers would provide. In a classic example of less is more, Doyle's abstract is, there are none. Abstracts can't get shorter than that. In conjunction with the title, his abstract provides a completely accurate and informative description of the results of his research. On the other end of the spectrum, sometimes more is more, or even more is just enough in an abstract. Including details in your abstract, such as data and numbers that support your conclusions, may be useful for your audience in determining whether to continue reading or not. It seems that a lot of people who are learning to write engineering reports resist providing numbers in their abstracts. Quantifying your results in your abstract is important enough that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it. A professor of mine once said that an engineer's job is to make a number. That just means that pretty much anything an engineer does is associated with mathematics. there should be a number of some kind that leads you to your conclusion or recommendation. When appropriate, it's important to include the numbers in your abstract that led to your conclusions. This example is an abstract from a peer-reviewed journal article, so the audience is engineers or faculty at universities with a strong technical background. It's fairly wordy, so please pause the video and read it before I start talking about it. It starts out with a why statement intended to give motivation to the study. In this case, the why of the article is one of the most important elements of the report. What was done is next. A new H-infinity deconvolution filter was developed. As in most abstracts, the audience is assumed to be familiar with these terms. Conversely, if they're not familiar with the terms, but the application appeared useful for their purposes, it's a reasonable expectation that the audience will read the article to find out what's going on. The second part of what was done, applying the filter to some ultrasonic non-destructive evaluation data, is next. It wraps up with the results of the study. In this case, that's a comparison between this new filter and a more standard filtering approach. This also contains a pseudo-quantitative comparison of the two filters. This abstract is a prime example of the difficulties of balancing brevity with depth and scope. The abstract would probably benefit from a numerical assessment of the behavior of the two filters. However, this might be better avoided since it might be too detailed for an abstract unless the comparison can be made with a single number, such as a percent error. It's probably reasonable to expect that an interested person would be willing to look at the results section of the report based on the assessment given in this abstract. The next example illustrates more of an abstract or summary that would appear in a company's internal report. Again, I recommend pausing the video and reading the example before I go on. The summary jumps right into the topic. The audience is obviously very familiar with the project and is probably the project engineer who requested that the work be done. It leads off with a conclusion. There's probably nothing to worry about. Most people will stop reading at that point. Numerical values for the surge pressures are provided. These will likely need to be passed on to whoever is doing the structural analysis for the vehicle. A recommendation is also included in this first paragraph. Some assumptions were made in creating the 3000 psi number that the author is obviously not really comfortable with. So he wants to create a computer model to do a better job of estimating the surge pressures. Finally, there's some important information relative to some redesign of the system to achieve these pressure levels. An orifice was added to the system and a tubing size is changed, probably to get the surge estimates down to an acceptable level. Notice that the author emphasizes that these design changes have already been approved by the group that's laying out the system. In short, the primary goals of this summary are to provide an estimated pressure value to use for stress analysis, document the design changes that were made during the course of the analysis, and emphasize that there's still ongoing analysis to reduce some of the uncertainty in the pressure estimates. All of this information needs to be committed to a written report. You must keep the people in charge of the project informed about this kind of information and keep your management aware of what kind of work is ongoing. It also keeps the author covered since you have a recorded transmission of the information in the event that the recommended design change doesn't get implemented for some reason. What the summary doesn't contain is extraneous information about how the analysis is done. It's very unlikely that the people that the information is intended for care about that. This example is similar to example 3, but would be for a slightly more general audience. Again, stop the video, read the summary, then I'll walk through it. There's more description at the beginning as to what the background of the problem is and why the analysis is being done. The concept of enable surges are introduced and a sentence is devoted to the physics involved in creating the surges. There's very little detail though. Your abstract almost always has to assume some existing background knowledge on the part of your audience. There's also less detail about the specific pressure values. It's sufficient for this audience to know that the stress group, who are the people who get to decide whether the pressures are acceptable, have said that the estimated values won't cause a problem. Finally, there's a brief statement relative to the type of analysis that was done, which is probably not important, but leads to an important statement that the analysis is conservative. This just means that the estimated pressure numbers are very likely too high, which reinforces the conclusion that the surge pressures aren't a problem. I've been calling the summary of the report contents an abstract. This isn't really a universal term. There are a lot of different names for the section of your report that summarizes your results. Your summary can go under a variety of different names. Probably the most common is summary. That's what we tended to call it at the company I used to work for anyway. If you're giving a report to higher management, the term executive abstract or executive summary are popular. My take is that you call it an executive summary because executives like being reminded that they're executives. A better definition is that executives tend to not be experts in the technical aspects of your report. They'll probably require a more detailed introduction to the problem. This information is also included in short reports like memos and emails, which tend to contain only the material you'd put in an abstract. In these cases, your audience only needs the information they need to act on. Any additional documentation will be contained in a separate report. Finally, the term subject often refers to what we've been calling a title, especially if the information is contained in a memo or an email. The information in the subject corresponds to what you would put in a title, though. There really isn't any functional difference between the two. It's just a different name. In general, I recommend that you not worry about what your abstract or summary is called. Regardless of its name, almost any report will need a short section giving your main results and conclusions. Your company or the journal you're submitting the report to will have a preferred name for this section. Be more concerned about how to create the content for this type of section. That's pretty consistent, regardless of what it's called.